Braxton Hunter. I've not covered him on my channel because he's not really been that problematic of a figure. He's not like a Mike Winger type where they seem unproblematic on the surface, just a standard run-of-the-mill internet preacher. And then, of course, you get into like their opinion on gay people, and then suddenly things get a little more problematic. But it's not like that. Let's talk about Braxton. Not himself personally, but a video that he put out. It's called 10 Questions for Atheists. Now, I have not personally watched this video yet, nor have I watched any of the responses to it yet. But I am a type of person who, this channel used to live and breathe off of only atheist content, off of only responses to religious things. So there's a certain amount of like blood pumping that happens whenever we get another 10 Questions for Atheists thing. And usually when we get these, the title of them is 10 Questions Atheists Can't Answer, which sounds really snide and full of themselves. And that's not really what's happened here with Braxton. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video and see what we get from there.
The worldview discussions space can be so combative. And
True.
when atheists and Christians come up with lists of questions that they don't think the other side can answer, those questions usually aren't genuine.
There's a reason I've not made one of those lists. Now, granted, there are things that I have done on my channel where I do believe there is a catch-22, like when I talk about things like the Euthyphro dilemma. But in general, I try not to make those kind of lists because they end up being disingenuous. Especially when you're talking about Christianity, sometimes when you make these kinds of lists, you might end up asking 10 questions, but only 3 of them are aimed at Catholics, and then 3 of them are aimed at Southern evangelicals, and then 1 or 2 of them are aimed at Mormons. And it ends up creating this straw man of what Christianity is through the application of the questions, which is the same thing that we get when Christians or Muslims or anyone does the same thing for atheists, where they'll make their 10 questions, and you can kind of tell through the questions that they're asking what their straw man version of atheism is. So let's go ahead and see what version we can get out of Braxton. He says that he's not going to be doing any of that, so I'm going to go and take him on his word.
I've never made a list like that, although I've responded to some. Here, I hope my atheist interlocutors
We are going
will
to play
consider
back
these
speed this a
questions
bit.
deeply without giving glib answers. These aren't meant to be gotcha questions, though I'm not asking for no reason. I expect you will have answers, and I want to hear what the most sincere among you have to say. With that, here are my 10 questions for atheists.
Okay, let's go.
What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well? And for those of you that would point out atheism isn't a worldview, I'm talking about you, your worldview that includes atheism. I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions, including supernatural events in those other religions.
So, is there something that Christianity doesn't necessarily cover within my worldview? It depends. So within my worldview, the logical problem of evil is pretty easily solved. Simply don't have a deity. Within the Christian worldview, depending on the Christian worldview we're talking about, it might not be so easily solved. The Euthyphro dilemma is also something that atheism generally accounts for. You don't have to worry about if good comes from God or if God is beholden to some abstract idea of good if you don't believe in a God. So I'd say that those are 2 things that probably function for this space. The other thing that I would say probably functions for this space pretty well is there certain paradoxes that necessarily exist within a particular versions of the Christian God, which don't exist when you either nix powers from that version of the Christian God or nix that God out entirely, which again is a concept that you would find within something like atheism. So what are these contradictions that I'm talking about? Well, one of them would be the mathematical contradiction of the Trinity, depending on if you are a Trinitarian Christian. Now, again, this is the problem with a lot of these kind of things, is that you end up being dependent on the kind of Christian you're dealing with. If you're not a Trinitarian Christian, then skip this portion. But when you're dealing with the Trinity, you're dealing with characters who are necessarily God, or at least contain some essence of godhood, but then are also necessarily not God, but they are necessarily monotheistic deities, but I just used a plural there, you end up having a lot of issues here. It also breaks down mathematically. If Jesus is A, if Holy Spirit is B, and if God the Father is C, and D is God, A equals D, B equals D, C equals D, mathematically, necessarily, these all should end up terminating because A should equal B and B should equal C. But they don't, because A and B are completely different characters with different properties. Now, there are some ways Christians have around this, but the other issue, aside from the Trinity, would be the tri-omniness of God, which, again, is solved pretty easily within atheism because I don't have to worry about those issues where a God is concerned. But I don't want to get into issues of triomniness because the question is about what material facts can we agree on, and I probably don't agree on his God having any of those properties here, but
science and differences among different denominations of Christianity.
So it also there's another thing to point out here. He did bring up science. I do want to point out that when it comes to the sciences, yes, you can have versions of Christianity where these are accounted for, but it depends. So if your version of Christianity is necessarily a young Earth creationist version of Christianity, then my worldview that includes atheism and includes a certain level of materialism accounts for things like the age of the Earth. But if you are a young Earth creationist, your Bible might account for those things, but it does not do it accurately. I don't believe that Braxton is a young Earth creationist. I don't think that that's the case with Braxton. So, again, it's hard to answer that when you're specifically saying my version of Christianity, when I don't know, I have not seen enough of Braxton's content to know what his version of Christianity necessarily is. And I don't want to accidentally strawman him by saying that, well, materialism in the way that I understand it lets me understand the age of the Earth, even though when you look at Braxton, he might agree on what I would think the age of the Earth is, or how I believe the evolutionary process works. So it's hard to say. I need to know exactly a material point of disagreement between the two of us first, and I don't have that data.
But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does. Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences.
So universal religious experiences generally are answered pretty easily under atheism. What we consider a religious experience can just as easily be a hallucination as it is anything else, a misconception. Especially if you are big into philosophy, what we perceive in the world, what we see, isn't necessarily ontological truth. However, whether or not that ontological truth is a particular thing, I don't know, and you don't know, but we have certain beliefs and assumptions about those things. So, for instance, I look at my wall and I see teal. Someone else may look at the wall and they may see blue. Someone else may look at that wall and they may see green, depending on how the cones in their eyes function. We all agree that the wall has at least a color there, but we don't agree on what color is being represented there. And of course, in material reality, that's because color doesn't necessarily exist. There are wavelengths, and the only way in which our eyes can perceive those wavelengths in the way that they function is what we describe as color. But we still can't agree on that necessarily. So when you talk about things like religious experiences, it may be that those universal, again, this is not super well defined, but those universal religious experiences are in fact legitimate experiences. It may also be that they are not. They could be hallucination. Who am I to say? This is one of the reasons I don't have an issue getting along with most theists, because, again, who am I to say? I was not in your shoes around the time you had that experience. But it's just as likely to me, within my framework, that experience was some form of illegitimate. And I'm hoping I'm not being insulting when I say that.
Free will, morality, near-death experiences, beauty, the rapid experience.
So free will, that's an interesting one. So if we're going to have a disagreement about free will, and I don't mean to keep on cutting him off in very particular points on this question, but if we're talking about free will, if you believe in the omniscience of God, then necessarily your worldview does not account for the omniscience of God, and my worldview doesn't have to. So if your worldview includes an omniscient God, you believe that God knows everything, necessarily all things that will be, then if he knows you're going to jump up in the air at 10 a.m. on next Tuesday morning, what will you be doing on 10 a.m. next Tuesday morning? Well, necessarily you will be jumping in the air. Elsewise, God does not know. God does not believe you will do something. He knows you will do something, which necessarily means you will have to do it. You are beholden to it. Because you have not done it yet, your ability to do anything is contingent on God's knowledge of the thing you will do. That is accounted for much better in a world where, again, this is all materialistic. Whether or not free will truly exists is another discussion entirely. It's a super fun one to have. I personally don't believe it exists. But when we're talking about what does one worldview account for and one worldview doesn't, if your worldview includes an omnibenevolent God, it necessarily does not account for free will, because free will necessarily cannot exist within that world.
Expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. And
the rapid expansion of the early church. Okay, so if rapid expansion of a church, of any kind, doesn't matter that it's the early church or not, if rapid expansion of a church is going to be our criteria for anything, then there are other religions that necessarily we have to consider. So that's I don't see how that one is a point where Christianity accounts for it. Materialism accounts for that just fine.
Shared longing for purpose and meaning. So
a shared longing for purpose and meaning, that would just be an end result of our sapience.
What is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
Okay, so it depends on what you mean by as well. Because if you mean as well as in as well as, like it answers this just like yours answers this, then linguistically I'd have to go, well, yeah, they both answer it, but which one answers it better? And there comes the other reasoning of as well. I don't know which as well he means. Does he mean as well as in on top of, or does he mean as well as in better than? If he means as well as in better than, then there are certain things that are not answered better by the Christian worldview. But again, it depends on which Christian worldview. There's a lot of different ones out there.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies, doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God? After all, these are entities and beings that you likely believe do not exist. And if your response is that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus and don't actively believe that he does not exist, doesn't that sound a little disingenuous, honestly?
So it does, but let's go ahead and go over this. So, yes, lacktheism, lack of belief, which is where I function mostly, does in fact mean that you lack a belief in God, the concept. But if there are particular versions of a God that you believe, such as I do, that have logical terminations within them that are contradictory, so a triomni God, for instance, is a logical contradiction, especially if you're a type of person that believes that God is the author of the laws of logic, we end up having a problem. But if you are going to have a God who necessarily is logically incomprehensible, like a triomni God, then I would say that that particular God, that one right there, I do not believe in him. I strictly do not believe in that God. But the concept of God, the universal concept of God, insofar as it can be defined in a myriad of ways, I lack a belief in that concept. There are certain ones that I believe end up having terminations in my mind where I go, no, I don't believe in that God. I believe that God necessarily does not exist. But if it's the concept of God, I lack a belief in that. And I think that might be where the hang-up is here. Because for me, there's no issue with me saying that your God, let's take the Christian God, the triune variant of the Christian God, your God necessarily exists in the same category of other logically impossible things like Santa Claus, like the Easter Bunny. But that does not mean that the concept of God, which your version of God is not synonymous with, I can't also have a lack of belief in that greater concept. This is the difference between local atheism and global atheism. Global atheism is when you reject all concepts of God, whether you've heard them or not, whether they've been explained to you or not, whether they've even been conceived of or not. Whereas certain variants of local atheism deal with certain subgroups of ideas we have on God.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things. I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military. I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements. But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
So I do understand it, but I don't find it to be a legitimate criticism at that point, because a sin is necessarily some type of affront to a god. But if you don't believe in a god, then, well, the ability to sin is it's impossible to, because there's no god to affront. Moreover, if you just end up believing in a different god who does not hold issues with things like sex work, you'd have this issue with polytheists as well. The reason that people end up having those worldview changes is because a lot of times, for instance, they'd have a particular view on something like homosexuality, and while they may have internalized that view for their own reasons, bigotry or what have you, a lot of times the scapegoat they hide behind is their Bible. And when they lose that as an excuse, they then have to confront, well, why did I believe that in the first place? And if they can't come up with a good reason, the honest person changes their position on that. Or at least the honest person accepts the fact that they've illogically come to a conclusion, whether or not that results in that conclusion's termination. Can I understand why people think, from the Christian perspective, that people become atheists just to sin? I can understand it. I just don't agree with it. And I'm not going to respond to the different issues where sex work is concerned, because, in my opinion, especially as a leftist, sex work is work. If I can sell my body for labor to a McDonald's or to a Walmart or to something to lift something, to clean something, then what's the difference between that and selling my body for any other kind of labor? What is the functional difference there, aside from the fact that certain people find something gross?
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25? And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief, as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
Again, I went over this earlier, but it depends on the type of God we're talking about. You can be a lack of belief atheist when we're talking about the global sense of atheism, when we're talking about global atheism in general. You can even just accept agnosticism on there, where you've suspended your belief there, which necessarily means that it's not that you're 50-50, 70-40, what have you. When it comes to logic, if you are an agnostic, you are removed from the equation. You don't have a 50-50, 70-20, 10-90 type of deal. You are removed from the equation completely. That's how Thomas Huxley defined agnosticism. But again, if we are talking about the differences between local and global atheism, I can have a local atheism towards the Abrahamic gods, knowing their history, knowing the logical consequences of them, and knowing the logical issues with them. I can have a complete and total termination of those ideas in my mind while still having a lack of belief in the idea of a god in general, which is where I sit, which, again, as Huxley put it, that would be agnosticism.
Now, I know we've all got our talking points, but I want you to struggle to be as sincere with yourself as you can right now. Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those? It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe, and all the attempts to try and circumvent that problem seem desperate and at least far less likely than theism. My question isn't just what do you typically say about this, because I'm well aware of the responses. My question is simply this: when you step away from the debate mode that it's so easy for us all to get into online, doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit? It seems to fit really poorly with any worldview that includes atheism.
No, it doesn't destabilize me at all. You see, there's nothing that's actually logically wrong with infinity. Infinity going backwards. There's nothing about that that is necessarily improper. Because if so, then we have to use that same kind of logic when we're talking about a god. If infinity going backwards and infinity going forwards are an issue, then, well, your god is an issue. But if they're not, then we don't have an issue there. Sometimes there is not necessarily a comfort, but there is an honesty in saying, I don't know. Because I don't. Now, I know that a lot of the math seems to come down to a couple of like microseconds before t equals 0, and we don't really know much past that point, and I'm completely okay saying, I don't know. The thing is, though, is that I'm fairly certain that you don't know either. Now, I'm sure we both have a belief, and one of those beliefs might even be knowledge, insofar as knowledge is simply a belief you have which happens to line up with ontology. But personally, I'm comfortable saying, I don't know. I believe there was infinity going backwards, especially since the universe came from an infinitely singular point, and matter itself is eternal. We cannot destroy it. We cannot create it. I don't have a problem saying I don't know what that first cause was. I'm also okay saying that that's fine. And I don't believe you know either. We simply have different beliefs here. One of those beliefs might be knowledge. Or neither of them.
Of the arguments for God's existence, is there one that to you seems more interesting than the rest? Is there one that for you actually does weigh in favor of theism? Which one?
So, deism is probably one of the closest ones for me that I would say leans me into an existence for a God. Because the idea that we have an infinite universe, even insofar as t equals 0 was an infinitely singular point, and then that point, for lack of a better word, expanded, exploded, whatever, to give us the base elements that slowly formed into our universe that we know today, I see no problem accepting, though I don't believe it myself, but accepting that a God could have come in as a first cause, tapped that universe to become its first cause, the little bit of energy, the little bit of inertia needed to turn all that potential energy into kinetic energy, and then left, necessarily not being there at all from that point forward. I don't see an issue with that, personally. And if there was a God belief that I were to hold to, it would be something like that. Now, I know there's probably going to be some atheist out there who wants to respond to this by saying Spinoza's God, since we can actually see the observable universe to some degree, and Spinoza basically did a word game where he switched universe with God, but I don't find that to be an actual form of theism, personally. So, I guess for me, the answer would be deism, if there was one that I had to get close to.
Most atheists I've met humbly admit that they don't think they can have absolute certainty about much of anything. But what they want from the Christian is a demonstration that God exists or that Christianity is true. Well, when we offer the reasons to believe that we do have, those are typically deemed not good enough. So what sort of evidence, if any, would be enough to convince you? Do you know? And since it's often a conversation stopper, let's take experimental reproducibility off the table, since that's not even always necessary for science.
So, experimental reproducibility not being necessary for science, it depends on what science we're talking about. But regardless, I'm not going to sit on that point there. That one felt like it was just injected in. Let's talk about what I would accept as evidence for a God. Like Braxton said, the answer would necessarily be, I don't know. Because anything that I would find to be, this must certainly be divine, for me to make that assumption, I have to have something to compare it to. I have to be able to compare this event with something else that I also labeled divine in order to figure it out. Let me give you an example. If I were blind, how would you describe the color red to me? How would you describe the color green to me? It's very hard to describe those colors when I don't have a reference point. I have nothing to reference at all. And when you start describing those colors to me, if you start describing red as it's a warm color, it's a hot color, it's a color that can give you comfort, and it's a color that if used too much can cause you to be impulsive and even cause pain. Let's take green. This is a calming color. This is the color of nature. Think of a bed of grass under you. If I start saying things like that, think of the slime of the algae on the water as you tried to wade through it. If I start describing those things to you, much like with descriptions of divinity, we necessarily hit a wall where you've managed to describe these things completely with the absence of divinity. The absence, in this case, of color. So why should I accept that the divinity was even real in the first place? I mean, even with color, we can accept the fact that color is not real, Color is just a thing we perceive. There is wavelength there, and that wavelength actually does a thing, and then we react to it and perceive it. But if I cannot compare something that a god has shown me or something that a god has done to something else, how am I to assume that something is divine? How am I to make that judgment call? I don't really think I can. Now, the default answer here is if we're talking about an omniscient God, an all-knowing God, then that God knows what would convince me, and that's all that matters. But that only works in two scenarios. Scenario 1, the God is truly omniscient, and scenario 2, the God necessarily wants me to know he exists. If we're talking about a deistic God, we're talking about certain polytheistic gods, we might not be dealing with a God that cares whether or not I know it exists or even worship it. So that answer really only works for a certain variety of gods. But, you know, there's the answers for the stream.
To what extent did social and moral issues start you down the path toward your atheism? That is to say, the typical Christian or religious views on sexuality, gender, rights, and acts and commands of God in the Old Testament. It seems that many deconversion stories online begin with, or at least include, LGBT issues, purity culture, or hell as instrumental in the deconversion process. It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were. I honestly wonder how much those issues and ones like them motivate the deconversion rather than all this talk about evidence.
So, for me, and I've gone over my my story on my channel, for me it was a very slow, organic process. I didn't sit there and have a moment of disgust when I read that the most moral man in Sodom wanted his children to be raped by the village. I didn't have a moment where I thought, why did God need a blood sacrifice for all this? None of that really happened. For me, it was just several years of not being exposed constantly to functionally Christian propaganda. I grew up in Pensacola Christian Academy, which is an old IFB Seventh-day Adventist funded ordeal, and they were very good at scaring the hell out of you, to put it lightly. Those things didn't play a part in me deconverting. I deconverted very organically because I originally wanted to be a theologian. As I started taking a little bit of time studying the history of the Bible, studying how it was written, studying that the version that I was taught all the time was the correct one, was the KJV, figuring out the history of how that was written, all the flaws that went into it, coming to a point where I can't really necessarily say that the God of this book is real. It started with me saying, well, the book is bullshit, but the God is real. And then another year or two later going, well, hold on. If the book is bullshit, what functionally am I actually grounding this God in? What evidence do I have for it past that? Well, I don't. And so about a 5-year-ish process, 3 to 5 years, I just kind of slowly slid out of it. Now, the actual logical problems with God came later. The actual issues that I have with individual mandates in the Bible came later. I didn't know about that stuff because that stuff wasn't taught to me. I discovered that stuff well after I deconverted. So, how much did that stuff play in my deconversion? Not a whole lot. For me, it was just not being constantly exposed to it. It was not being constantly propagandized about it anymore. It was being allowed to think for myself that slowly allowed me to just move away from that kind of thinking.
Can you name the last 3 academic books you read by theists on the subject? How long ago did you read them? Or is most of your understanding of apologetics and atheism from non-scholarly internet sources, pop-level books, and, let's face it, YouTube videos? And be honest with yourself about this. Anyone can Google up a list of books and paste them in the comments section. But I want to know, are you getting the best from the other side?
Could I name the last 3? Let's see here. Where's my phone? That'd probably be the best place to find this. I know that the last stuff that I read, I believe, was from Hugh Ross, but it depends on if you consider that academic or pop level. If you consider that pop level, then I guess that would be none. But I know that Hugh Ross was the last one that I specifically remember reading. Let me go through here. Something else. If you don't count Hugh Ross's books, which the main reason I read those was I misrepresented him in one of my earliest videos, and so I guess not necessarily as atonement for doing that, but I wanted to go through and read some of his stuff. Improbable Planet was the one I was directed to first. So I guess really one book for me, and then after that, it's mostly been the apologetics that have been presented by people like Mike Winger, that have been presented by the little bit that I've seen from people like Braxton Hunter, and then, of course, any of the various videos that I do. Whenever I'm responding to something, I will delve into the academic literature as best I can. Some of the stuff revolving around, like, Calvinism and stuff like that, when I was dealing with that. I also have Reformed Calvinist friends, so, there you go. But if I had to name one off the top of my head, the only one that comes to mind off the top of my head, if you don't count, again, pop shit by, like, Tim LaHaye and stuff like that, that'd be Hugh Ross's literature. That's probably about it. Probably the most disappointing there. Sorry to disappoint you, Braxton. Sorry to disappoint you.
Let's finish with a pretty common one. If you found out today, to your satisfaction, that Christianity were true, would you accept God's authority, repent of your sins, and trust Jesus as your king?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. So it depends. If which version of Christianity are we talking about? Is this the Mormon Christianity? Is this the Catholic version? Is this one of the Southern Evangelical types? Is this the Jehovah's Witnesses style of Christianity? Now, I know some of those are a lot less probable since they're a lot newer, but it depends on which kind of Christianity. And depending on which kind, I may or may not. If we're dealing with like a mere Christianity sense, then I would accept that there is an authority, but it might be accepting it almost to the level of like accepting a manager's authority at the job. You don't like it, you might not even like him, and you don't agree with half the shit he does, but you accept the fact that there's really no other option. I've said before on my channel that depending on the type of Christianity that ends up being true, if that is the case, you may have moved me simply from lacktheism or agnosticism, atheism, depending on your definition. You may have moved me from that into a type of mesotheism. Not necessarily anything besides that. But it depends on the kind of Christianity. It really does. If we're dealing with an actual, truly loving deity that is truly loving, like literally did not flood the world, was not necessarily omnipresent and omniscient, and as a result is not logically responsible for every single bad thing that has ever happened, because that's kind of the issue of entailment, that's the issue of logical consequence, then maybe. But again, it really and truly depends, because not every version of the Christian deity is the same. Not every Christian worldview is the same. Not every interpretation of that deity is the same. So it truly depends. But for the most part, if it's the picture of the deity that exists in my head, then you've made me a mesotheist, or at the best, a disgruntled employee of Christianity, which is not a great thing to be if you're also a lefty. But those are my takes. Those are my answers. I hadn't seen the video prior to this, so that's as honest as I can be with them. I didn't craft any of this beforehand, but I knew I wanted to respond to this, and I haven't seen any of the other content creators' responses to this yet, so hopefully this is as honest and as unmocking a response to it as I can get. So, hopefully you enjoyed that. If not, let me know in the comments section. Go ahead. I'm sure there's at least somebody who doesn't like any of my responses to that and was going to tell me I'm going to burn in hell. But I guess the other thing would be, if you are at the end here, please go check out my Patreon. And if you don't want to do that, then please hit the like button, maybe subscribe, hit the bell notification icon. All that stuff is super helpful. And if you haven't done it already, I would super hope that you would. So please, thank you, and I will see you all in the next video.